Pisces. There are seasons in life when you can't quite point to what's changing. You just know that inside, things no longer feel still the way they once did. You're still living, still moving through familiar routines, still listening to the world around you. But somewhere deeper, your emotions begin to rearrange themselves. What once required so much effort no longer feels as heavy. And the connections you once thought were unclear start taking on a very different shape. This isn't a story about promises, and it's not about outcomes you can count on. It's simply an invitation to listen to yourself more closely, as love, respect, and that quiet sense of belonging shift in their own unique way. And if you're ready, let's begin with the very first moment, the moment when everything starts to move in silence. Pisces. Some connections don't arrive in the way we once imagined. They don't need clear signs. They don't come with declarations. No one stands in front of you and says, "This matters." They show up when you're tired of asking questions, when you stop forcing everything into familiar shapes, when you allow life to move at its own rhythm. Lately, you may sense a very subtle shift, nothing overwhelming, just the feeling that you're stepping into a different emotional space, one where you no longer react the way you used to. What once made your heart respond so intensely now meets a different gaze. Connections that once left you confused suddenly feel easier to understand. Not because others changed, but because you changed where you stand in your own story. It's like the tide changing direction, no announcement needed, no audience required. And yet the ocean knows exactly what it's doing. Pisces often feels before understanding. You sense something approaching long before it has a name. And this time is no different. You may not be able to define what this connection is. It could be a person, it could be a sense of belonging, it could simply be a new state of mind. One where you no longer feel the need to prove that you deserve care. There are moments when you sit alone and realize you don't feel as empty as before. Not because every question has been answered, but because you're no longer afraid of not having the answers. That's the sign of an inner movement, slow, deep, and unmistakably real. For many years, Pisces waited for connection to come through effort, trying to understand others, trying to hold things together, trying not to hurt anyone, even when you were exhausted yourself. But now, you're learning something different. You're learning how to remain with your own emotions without needing to explain them. You're learning that not every connection needs an immediate definition, and that some things only become clear when you give them enough space to take shape on their own. You may not be ready to name this yet. And that's completely okay, because the most enduring connections rarely come from urgency. They're born in the moment you pause and listen to yourself more than the noise around you. Pisces. If you feel your heart softening, if you no longer feel compelled to chase a familiar emotional pattern, if you begin choosing emotional safety over drama, then perhaps you're standing very close to a new threshold. And no need to step through just yet. Simply notice that you're there, because sometimes change doesn't require a grand action. It only asks you to realize that you are no longer the person shaped by old cycles. And from that moment on, a connection, whether with another or with yourself, begins to form in its own quiet, distinct way. Pisces. For a long time, you lived as if your presence only truly mattered when you were giving something to others. You were there to listen, there to feel on their behalf, there to keep everything smooth and balanced, even when inside, you were holding yourself together. You grew used to being the understanding one, used to stepping ahead to avoid conflict, used to giving first, and only later wondering whether anything would come back to you. And slowly, that way of living became a habit so familiar you barely noticed it. You stopped calling it sacrifice. You simply thought of it as how you existed inside relationships. But maybe now, at this point in your life, you're beginning to notice something else, not through logic, but through a very real sensation in your body. You no longer want to explain yourself over and over again. You no longer feel the need to prove that you deserve to be heard. You no longer feel obligated to keep everyone happy just to make them stay. This isn't a loud shift, and it's not a decision made in a sudden emotional moment. It's more like finally feeling your feet on the ground and realizing you don't have to keep moving just to be acknowledged. There may have been a time when you believed that if you stopped, everything would leave you. That if you didn't try as hard as before, the familiar connections would fade away. But what you're seeing now is a different perspective. When you stop chasing validation, what doesn't belong to you naturally creates distance. And what does belong begins to change how it approaches you. You don't have to pull anyone closer. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations. You simply stand in the place that is truly yours. And that alone creates a powerful difference. Pisces. There is a kind of value that cannot be built through constant effort. It only appears when you stop convincing the world and begin trusting your own inner knowing. When you no longer feel guilty for setting boundaries. When choosing peace no longer feels selfish. When you stop explaining why respect matters to you. That's when you understand this. True value doesn't need to be displayed. It's recognized by those who are perceptive enough to see it. And people like that don't enter your life by taking up space. They adjust the distance. They choose how to come closer, slowly and with care. You don't need to change who you are to be loved. You don't need to become less sensitive. You don't need to be stronger than the version of yourself you already are. You only need to stay aligned with the person you've become after everything you've lived through. And maybe, for the first time in a very long while, you feel lighter because you're no longer proving anything. From that place, you begin to attract connections that don't require you to trade away parts of yourself. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you stopped doing the things that pulled you away from who you truly are. Pisces, your value was never measured by how much you gave. It has always lived in whether you were willing to stay with yourself. And when you do, the right people recognize that to step into your world, they must arrive with respect, not demands. Pisces, there were connections that entered your life with an unspoken condition, that you should make yourself smaller so everything could run smoothly, that you should be gentler, more agreeable, ask fewer questions, that your emotions needed to be adjusted to fit the situation. And you did that, not because you were weak, but because you believed in harmony. You believed that if you softened yourself just a little, life would feel easier for everyone involved. But the connection forming now carries a very different tone. It doesn't ask you to step back. It doesn't require you to sand down the edges of your emotions to fit into someone else's world. It doesn't place you in the position of choosing between staying and being who you truly are. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself over and over just to be understood. You don't have to break down every subtle feeling to avoid being misunderstood. You don't weigh every word out of fear of being seen as too sensitive. Here, listening happens naturally. Not because someone is trying, but because they genuinely want to understand what you're moving through. You may notice this in very small moments. The way someone pauses to let you finish your sentence. The way they don't rush to give advice. The way they allow space for your emotions to unfold at their own pace. Pisces. A healthy connection doesn't put you on guard. It doesn't keep you in a constant state of explaining yourself. It doesn't lead you back to that familiar question. Am I too much? Instead, your body begins to relax, your breathing deepens, and your mind no longer tightens at the thought of having to hold everything together. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, you don't have to fight to be respected. That respect arrives quietly, like something already built into the foundation, not something you have to earn. And if love is present in this connection, it doesn't carry the weight of insecurity. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't pull you into emotional cycles that drain you. It feels more like a safe space where you can set your feelings down. A place where you don't have to be strong all the time, where vulnerability doesn't need to be hidden to be accepted. Pisces once learned how to love through endurance, but this experience is teaching you a different lesson. That affection doesn't have to come with loss. That closeness doesn't require you to trade away your inner peace. You begin to realize that you don't need to sacrifice what matters most just to keep someone close, because the right people would never put you in that position to begin with. You may not have a name for this connection yet, and there's no need to rush one. Sometimes what matters isn't the label, but the way time slows down when you're inside it. Pisces. If you feel yourself being met with kindness, if your emotions are treated as valid, if you no longer have to tell yourself, just hold on a little longer, then perhaps you're standing in front of a form of connection very different from anything you've known before. Not something that exhausts you to maintain, but something that makes you want to stay. Because it allows you to be fully present, not as the one who sacrifices, but as someone who is worthy of respect. Mid-February doesn't feel like a door swinging wide open. It feels more like a gentle curve on a long road, a place where you don't need to stop, but you slow down just enough to realize you've come farther than you thought. There's no cheering, no clear signal saying everything has changed. Just a very real, very human feeling that you're no longer walking with the same inner posture as before. You may notice this in the most ordinary moments. When a name crosses your mind without carrying weight. When an old memory no longer pulls your chest downward. Or when you imagine tomorrow and don't feel the need to brace yourself for it. This isn't excitement, it's relief. Pisces. This point of contact doesn't ask you to make a decision. It doesn't force you to choose a new direction right away. It simply reminds you, quietly, that you're standing somewhere different, a place where your breathing feels steadier when you look ahead. You may have grown used to being pulled back into what is already past. Unfinished stories, unresolved emotions, words that were never spoken. But right now, the energy isn't holding you there anymore. And it isn't pushing you to run faster just to catch up to something. It allows you to be present in this moment without feeling late, without feeling left behind. Mid-February feels like a very brief pause to check your inner compass. Not to change direction, only to make sure the needle is still pointing where you truly want to go. You may find yourself thinking more slowly, responding with less sharpness, and the things that once worried you, no longer taking up so much space in your mind. That doesn't mean everything is suddenly clear. It simply means you no longer need clarity right away to feel at ease. Pisces. A healthy connection rarely arrives with pressure. It doesn't make you watch the clock and wonder if you're moving at the right pace. It doesn't create the fear that if you pause, everything will fall apart. Instead, it gives you the sense that even if you stand still for a moment, the world around you continues to move in a gentle way. Around mid-February, you may realize you're no longer living in a state of waiting for something to finally happen. You begin to live with what's already here, and see that it's more complete than you once believed. Maybe you smile more when you're alone. Maybe you no longer rush to fill empty spaces with constant activity. Maybe you allow yourself to enjoy stillness without labeling it as loneliness. That's when you understand that balance isn't standing between two extremes. It's the ability to stay fully present with what's unfolding without pushing it away and without holding on too tightly. Pisces. This moment isn't a promise for the future. It's a gentle confirmation of the present, that you're moving forward with more awareness, that your choices are beginning to come from a place of self-respect. And in that moment, that you don't need extra motivation to keep going. You simply continue at your own rhythm, a pace that isn't rushed, but steady enough that you don't feel the need to turn back. And then, when you remain long enough at that point of contact, a new awareness slowly begins to surface. Not as a conclusion, but as an understanding that arrives late, after many years of living. Pisces. For a long stretch of your journey, you believed that love always came with endurance, that to stay connected, someone had to tolerate a little more, that to keep a relationship alive, one person would need to soften, step back, or fall silent when necessary. You didn't call that loss, you called it growth. You believed that deep emotions required an equal exchange, but the lesson unfolding now doesn't resemble that familiar shape. It doesn't arrive to erase your past. It simply offers gently a different way of seeing, that care doesn't have to be built on self-denial. You begin to realize that being valued doesn't require silencing your inner voice. That sincere attention doesn't make you hesitate every time you want to speak. And that being loved doesn't mean shrinking your emotions to fit the space. You may never have considered this before because you were used to adapting, used to placing other people's needs first, then convincing yourself that you were fine. But in this phase of your life, you're learning to listen to a very different signal, one that doesn't come from words, but from what your body tells you when you're no longer bracing yourself just to keep a connection alive. You begin to notice that a genuine bond doesn't wear you down. It doesn't drain the vitality within you. It doesn't leave you wondering whether you're giving too much. Instead, it expands you in a natural way. You feel more open without fearing harm. You feel curious about life without losing your sense of inner safety. You begin to recognize yourself as a fuller version of who you are. Not because you forced a change, but because you no longer need to hide any part of yourself. Pisces. This isn't a reward for those who endured long enough, and it isn't the result of doing everything right. It's simply what happens when you find the courage to live honestly with your emotions. When you allow yourself to admit that you too need care. When you permit yourself to want kindness without feeling guilty for it. You begin to understand that love doesn't need to prove itself through pain. That closeness doesn't have to be measured by the amount of sacrifice involved, and that connections with lasting value will never require you to trade away your peace just to survive. This realization may come slowly. You may still be watching it from a distance, not yet ready to name it or trust it completely, and that is perfectly okay, because this spiritual lesson doesn't ask you to act right away. It only asks you to acknowledge that another way of loving exists, a way that doesn't cause you to disappear inside your own story. Pisces. When you learn that you can be loved without having to trade parts of yourself, you don't just change how you enter relationships, you change how you show up in life. And from there, every connection, whether it arrives or leaves, becomes part of an expanding journey. But rather than a test of how much you can endure, if you've stayed with this story all the way to this moment, it's probably not because you were searching for an answer. It's more likely that somewhere in what's been shared, you recognized yourself quietly. Pisces. Not every connection needs a name right away. Not every feeling needs a clear conclusion. Some things only ask to be felt long enough for you to know whether they truly belong to you. You don't need to rush forward, and you don't need to keep looking back. You only need to notice one simple thing. When you're in that presence, whether it's with a person, a relationship, or simply with yourself, do you feel safe? Not the kind of safety that comes from control, but the kind that lets your body soften, that allows your breath to settle, that lets you move within your own rhythm without fearing that you'll disappoint someone. There may have been a time when you believed you had to work very hard to deserve good things. That gentleness had to be paid for with pain, that if something felt too easy, it couldn't be meaningful. But now, you're entering a different season, a place where peace is no longer mistaken for boredom. A place where kindness isn't rare, but the minimum standard you're allowed to expect. What is truly meant for Pisces doesn't require pulling you away from yourself to exist. It doesn't ask you to prove your worth. It doesn't demand that you sacrifice the most essential parts of who you are just to stay. These things arrive with gentleness, not to test you, but to remind you how much you've already lived through. And they remain through respect, not because you hold on tightly, but because they fit the person you're becoming. And they always begin the moment you stop doubting that you deserve to be treated with sincerity. Pisces, you don't have to believe in anything right away. You only need to stop denying your own feelings, stop dismissing your vulnerability, stop treating your need for love as something excessive. Because when you allow yourself to live just a little more honestly, you don't only change how you enter relationships, you change how you enter each day. And if right now you're standing in a place that isn't clear, without answers, unsure of what will continue and what may come to an end, trust that this doesn't slow you down. Sometimes that pause itself is the space required for what truly belongs to you to find its way in. If this story wasn't told to promise you anything, it's only here as a very gentle reminder that you don't need to become someone else to be loved in the way you deserve. And when you leave this video carrying just a little more lightness, understanding yourself just a little more clearly, then that is already enough.